In many ways, the Serapeum is Egypt writ large, in which its core beliefs are taken to extremes.
Being down here really makes you feel minuscule. You realise you're now walking amongst the gods. Words fail me, frankly, because of the enormity of it all, but that was the thing. That was the skill of the Egyptians. They batter you over the head with this idea of the colossal, the monumental, the spectacular.
Yet the Egyptians' devotion to the Apis bull had left them vulnerable. By embodying the power of Egypt within a single living animal, they had created an easy target.
Given the Apis bull's divine status, harming it would have been completely unthinkable. But when the Persian king Cambyses invaded Egypt, he had other plans. The Persian Empire is swept west, taking all before it, and then into Egypt itself. The Persian king Cambyses entered Egypt in 525 BC and destroyed the Saite dynasty.
Much like the Assyrians, the Persians were ruthless expansionists, chiefly interested in enlarging their empire. And Cambyses seemed to have trampled all over Egypt's ancient traditions.
Having taken Egypt by force, Cambyses burnt the mummy of the previous Saite pharaoh before stabbing the Apis bull, which slowly bled to death. And by doing this, Cambyses was sending a very clear message to the Egyptians. I am now in charge.
For the next 200 years, the Egyptians were little more than the heavily taxed servants of the Persian Empire, and with all attempts at rebellion met with extreme retaliation, Egypt needed a saviour, an outsider who could be transformed by Egypt's powerful ideology, and in return could transform Egypt.
Enter the Macedonian Superman. Enter Alexander the Great.
Alexander was one of the world's greatest military leaders, and during his short life amassed an empire that stretched across 3 continents, founding over 70 cities that bore his name. After his initial defeat of the Persian king, Alexander marched unopposed into Egypt in 332 BC. The world's most successful empire builder had arrived, not only transforming Egypt's future, but preserving its ancient past.
It really is no exaggeration to say that Alexander the Great is one of the most remarkable people who ever lived. He really was the superhero of the ancient world. So you'd think that Egypt would be filled with his images. After all, he had saved them from the hated Persians. And yet, other than the great city of Alexandria that bears his name, he is remarkably hard to find within Egypt's traditional temples. Except here, in this modest little shrine at the heart of Luxor Temple.
Alexander was not only a brilliant soldier, but a master politician. Marching into Egypt's ancient capital Memphis, amid rumours he was the son of Egypt's last native pharaoh, this instantly plugged him into Egypt's long native history, and he was crowned as a traditional pharaoh.
Here he is, the great man, repeatedly across the walls of this limestone shrine. And yet you'd never know it was Alexander simply by looking, because he looks like every other Egyptian pharaoh. But he knew their secret, that to rule Egypt, you had to appear to be an Egyptian, and he did this brilliantly, to the extent that he had his name, his Greek name Alexandros, written in the Egyptian tradition, even in a royal cartouche. And it's the only giveaway that this is Alexander the Great, because there is his name. Alexandros, written in typical Egyptian style, and there he's even wearing the red and the white dual crown of a united land. And so he's encapsulating everything that it was to be an Egyptian pharaoh.
Just like the Kushite king Taharqa at Jebel Barkal, Alexander is shown offering incense to the king of the gods, Amun. But simply connecting with the gods wasn't enough. Alexander understood that real power came from becoming a god. And so he undertook a perilous journey across the Libyan desert to the remote oasis shrine of Siwa, where he could commune with the oracle of Amun himself.
And it's said in this legendary story that the god actually said to him, "You are my son." And from then on, something clicked in Alexander's mind, and he went off to conquer the rest of the ancient world, truly believing he was divine and he had the full blessing and support of Amun himself, the king of the gods of Egypt.
Alexander would only stay in Egypt for 6 short months. But during his time here, he founded a city that would be his lasting legacy, the great city of Alexandria. Built on the Mediterranean coast to create trading links with the rest of the ancient world, the later historian Arrian recorded that Alexander had laid out the city's general plan himself. But lacking chalk or other means, he resorted to marking it out with grain.
When a flock of birds began eating the grain, Alexander regarded this as a bad omen. Yet his religious advisor quickly spun bad news into good and interpreted this as a sign that the new city would soon prosper and would one day feed the whole world. A remarkably accurate prophecy.
For within a very few years, Alexandria would not only be Egypt's new capital, but the greatest city on earth. Although Alexander himself would never see it.
Yet despite his pious nature, Alexander was essentially a soldier. In his quest to conquer the Persian Empire, he left Egypt in 331 BC, never to return alive. Moving as far east as India, he conquered an empire of 2 million square miles before dying in Babylon, aged only 32, but still undefeated and still the Pharaoh of Egypt.
At death, Alexander was mummified, and his body became the focus of a power struggle. Some of his officers wanted him buried in his Greek homeland, but for others, he had to return to Egypt and be buried as a pharaoh, thereby preserving Egypt's long traditions. But it obviously meant that anyone who possessed his mummified body could also claim the throne of Egypt. And clues to this drama can be found here in the windswept desert of Saqqara.
10 years after he'd left Egypt alive, Alexander returned here, for his body had been mummified Egyptian style, and it became a hugely powerful talisman for whoever held the body of Alexander the Great held Egypt.
While en route to Greece, his cortege was diverted and his mummified body brought here to Egypt's ancient necropolis of Saqqara. Exactly where his tomb itself was remains a mystery. Although situated just meters from the Serapeum, is this collection of very un-Egyptian-looking statues.
And it's these somewhat sandblasted statues that give us a real clue that Alexander may initially have been buried somewhere close by.
Because these are the sculpted images of some of the greatest scholars and artists of ancient Greece. Although exactly who is who has kept academics scratching their heads for years, their likely identities reveal a direct link to the world in which Alexander grew up and was educated. Take Homer, for example. His great warrior hero Achilles was Alexander's lifelong role model. Plato, who had tutored Aristotle, who in turn had tutored Alexander. And Pindar, whose poetry had praised Alexander's Macedonian ancestors. As for who placed these statues here, The most likely candidate is Alexander's general and probable half-brother, Ptolemy. For by burying Alexander here, close to Egypt's ancient capital Memphis, Ptolemy could legitimize his own takeover of Egypt.
And by laying claim to Alexander's body and to Egypt, he founded the dynasty named after himself, the fabulous and outrageous Ptolemies.
Ruling Egypt for the last 3 centuries BC, the Ptolemaic dynasty would be Egypt's final flowering. 15 male kings all named Ptolemy, with their female co-rulers, half of whom were called Cleopatra. Macedonian Greek by descent, their dynasty would bring Greek style, culture, knowledge and fabulous wealth into Egypt, while at the same time immersing themselves in Egypt's irresistible religion and customs.
They were very, very sensitive to the cultural practices and the religious sensibilities of the Egyptians. They knew that to control this ancient land of Egypt, they had to tap into what made Egypt powerful, what made Egypt special. They wore the right clothes, the right crowns, they built the right temples, they worshipped the right gods.
And the Ptolemies relocated Egypt's capital from Memphis to their new super city, Alexandria. Built to Alexander's original plan, it was one of the most lavish construction projects on Earth.
The historian Strabo would later comment that the city had magnificent public precincts and royal palaces that covered a fourth or even a third of the entire area.
The colonnaded marble streets were over 10 metres wide. There were public baths, a huge gymnasium, and one of the greatest wonders of the ancient world, the 135-metre-tall Pharos Lighthouse that guided ships safely into port. And at the centre of the city, Alexander himself, whose mummified body had been exhumed from Saqqara and brought here. The Ptolemies had built a capital unlike anything Egypt had ever seen before. For in Alexandria,
immigrants gave it a freshness, a vivacity, and really kind of transformed the ancient culture. Whereas previously, Egyptian civilization had developed along the Nile and in many ways was quite inward-looking, quite insular. I think the fact that Alexandria was open to so many diverse influences, religiously, culturally, and this gave it a real air of tolerance. I think I'd have felt very at home here. There's a real sense of culture and learning and appreciation of life.
Today, Alexandria is the largest city on the Mediterranean, stretching for over 20 miles along the coast. As Egypt's largest seaport, it caters for over 80% of the country's imports and exports, a legacy that reaches directly back to the Ptolemies. Having improved Egyptian agriculture by reclaiming new farmland through increased irrigation, they supplemented the Egyptian staples with new crops such as cotton and better grapes for wine production. And today the markets of Alexandria still buzz with some of the early city's lively cosmopolitan style.
I'm going to try and find the nearest equivalent to ancient Egyptian delicacies, and these are dates, and the ancient Egyptians used to make pastries and bread from them because they had a very sweet tooth. I think I might have to taste one just for quality control, you understand. See how authentic they are. They are very nice. This is incense in its raw state, and of course this was burnt in temples and in funerary rites.
The port city of Alexandria became a huge hub of international trade, establishing routes with Greece, the Middle East, India, and even Britain. And as native Egyptian goods like papyrus and perfume flowed out of the country, new exotic luxuries like spices, silks, and wines poured in.
The Greeks loved olives, and so these were imported, and the Egyptians started to grow them. I'll definitely have some of these. Delicious. Black pepper. We've got to get some black pepper. This is one of the really, really popular things, certainly in Ptolemaic times, because markets had opened up, and certainly as far east as India, and the Greeks went crazy for this stuff. It's certainly lively shopping in Egypt. Never a dull moment.
With Alexandria now at the heart of the ancient world, the rest of Egypt benefited too. For determined to honour their adopted country's long history, the Ptolemies undertook a massive temple rebuilding and restoration programme. Indeed, modern visitors can often fail to realise that many of the places they visit were either built or restored by the Ptolemies.
Esna, Edfu, Dendera, Komombo, all of these are Ptolemaic buildings that tourists and scholars admire so much, and yet they really don't give sufficient credit to the people whose vision created them.
The most impressive of all such temples lies the farthest from Alexandria. Deep into Upper Egypt, close to Aswan, is the stunning Temple of Philae, which in Egyptian meant the end, since it was located at the very southern edge of Egypt. Much of the temple was built by Ptolemy II and his co-ruler and sister, Arsinoe.
There was a law passed by her husband, Ptolemy, to say a statue of Arsinoe had to be erected in every single temple in Egypt. She had to become its resident goddess.
Arsinoe was a powerful female pharaoh associated with the goddess Isis, a role the famous Cleopatra would adopt 2 centuries later. And under the Ptolemies, Philae became a major centre of the Isis cult.
And here, in the heart of Philae Temple, Arsinoe's golden statue would have stood side by side with that of Isis, so the walls are full of images of Isis and her fellow gods.
According to myth, Isis was responsible for the vital Nile flood, swelling the river as she wept tears of sorrow for her murdered husband Osiris, who she then resurrected. And with its spectacular location, Philae still retains its hugely spiritual atmosphere.
I think it's that sense of continuity you really feel when you're up here. You feel like you're at the centre of the world. I suppose for the ancient Egyptians you were, the centre of their religious world. And at this point, which was the heart of ancient Egyptian religion, way into the Christian era, way into the 6th century AD, kind of messes with your head. It's a very, very holy place, this.
But while Philae was becoming an increasingly important centre of Egyptian religion, its new capital, Alexandria, had become the leading centre of knowledge. For the Ptolemies created some of the first scholarships, attracting academics from across the world to study a wide range of subjects.
Biology, theology, astronomy, geometry, anatomy, philosophy.
And of course, my own personal favourite,
history.
And at the centre of this intellectual hothouse was the famous Royal Library. Up to 500,000 works were once housed within to compete with the famous schools of Plato and Aristotle in Athens. And today that legacy lives on, with Alexandria's striking new library.
Ptolemies really did appreciate that knowledge was power, and they wanted that power. So they brought together in this one single place some of the greatest works in human history. The plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles and Euripides, the works of Aristotle the philosopher, the Old Testament scriptures, and all the accumulated knowledge from the temples of ancient Egypt, all brought into this one single building.
The Great Library also contained the works of Herodotus, a Greek historian who travelled the length of Egypt over a century before the Ptolemies had come to power. His accounts sum up the Greek fascination with Egyptian society. Not only is the climate different from that of the rest of the world, and the river unlike any other river, but the people also, in most of their manners and customs, exactly reverse the common practice of mankind. For the women attend the markets and trade, while the men sit at home and do the weaving. Indeed, the level of equality of Egypt's women shocked Herodotus, something he vividly records when he witnessed a group of men and women travelling together by boat to the delta city of Bubastis. Some of the women make a noise with clappers, others play the oboe, while the rest of the women and men sing and clap their hands. Some of the women shout mockery to the women of that town they are passing, whilst others dance and others stand up and expose their private parts. In temples the length of Egypt, the Ptolemies ensured they were portrayed as Egyptian pharaohs, making them almost indistinguishable from their native Egyptian predecessors. Yet in Alexandria, the blend of Greek and Egyptian could sometimes create a hybrid of rather strange results.
Hi, Nermeen.
Hi, how are you?
Nermeen Sami is a local historian who spent years studying this remarkable tomb complex built just after the Ptolemaic period.
And here we come to the unique main burial chamber.
That's mad. That is fabulous. Guarded by Greek Doric columns, the entrance is covered in images of Egyptian gods who would ensure safe passage into the afterlife. It's like a tomb, but it's also like a temple.
A facade of a temple, but a typical Egyptian style.
Yeah. It's really...
Cobras protecting the entrance.
Yeah.
You know why cobras choosing to be presented in the tombs? Because the cobra has no eyelashes. It keeps her eyes open 24 hours, which means it's awake to protect the tomb for 24 hours a day and night.
I love these snakes. That's a very Greek-looking snake, but it's wearing a very little ancient Egyptian crown. That's crazy.
Exactly. Yeah.
They literally are throwing everything they've got at this tomb. I mean, Medusa, Horus, sun disk.
To guarantee
everything.
Safety.
This is the best guarded doorway I've seen in Egypt. It's got everything here. And the statues. They represent the inhabitants of the tomb, a single wealthy family. These two exhibit an odd mix of the Greek and Egyptian. I think the bodies are ancient Egyptian, the stance is ancient Egyptian, the man's kilt is Egyptian. From the neck down they're Egyptian, but from the neck up they're European. It's clear the tomb owners had done everything they could to ensure safe passage into the Egyptian afterlife. Oh look, it's the Apis bull. Even if they didn't quite understand how it all worked. All the features are there. You've got Thoth with, presenting the oils and Anubis doing the same, mummifying the dead. You've even got canopic jars underneath.
Canopic jars and feather of Maat, the goddess of justice. Without her approval, you will never cross the other side. He didn't forget to add a Greek touch in a lower part, two depictions of Dionysus.
Dionysus was the Greek god of wine and fertility. Clearly, these tomb occupants intended to continue the lives they lived in Alexandria into the beyond.
I want all what I enjoy in life to be with me
Of course.
in the other side.
Especially the wine. What a great place to spend eternity. Despite its rather cartoon-like quality, the apparent opulence of this tomb demonstrates the desire of the Alexandrian elite to integrate into Egyptian culture. Yet in many ways, it was little more than a veneer, hiding the real force that would ultimately destroy Egypt. For where the external invaders had largely tried and failed, Egypt's real nemesis would be the Ptolemies' famous love of luxury and excess. Much of this luxury was just a facade for the royals of Alexandria, notorious for their love of display.
were like actors on a stage. As one ancient commentator observed, everything in Egypt is simply play acting and painted scenery, a comment which cuts to the heart of this melodramatic monarchy, for whom image was everything.
Because while the ruling elite were living it up in Alexandria, other parts of Egypt were far from content. By the end of the 3rd century BC, Egypt was once more riven with civil war. Upper Egypt began to rebel, and it fell to Ptolemy V to try and fight the fires of anarchy. So not only did he portray himself as an Egyptian, he went even further in his support for Egypt's ancient beliefs. In doing so, he left the world one of its most famous ancient artifacts: the Rosetta Stone. It's best known as the means by which the French scholar Champollion was first able to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphs in 1822. And we can tell that the inscription on the stone was of huge importance because it was written out in 3 types of script: Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic.
In a way, you could almost describe it as a kind of news bulletin. It's the priests of Memphis issuing this decree to let as many people know exactly what the religious and the political policy was of crown and clergy.
And it particularly focuses on Ptolemy V's generous patronage.
The priests are praising him because he's the one that gives wealth to the temple and gives due honour and respect to the sacred animals, which were such an integral part of Egyptian religion. The priests really are grateful to their Ptolemaic pharaoh, who they see as wanting to sort of tap in to the ancient Egyptian culture and ancient Egyptian religion, much like Alexander had, much like the Sayites had and the Kushites had. They knew that to attain true power, true control in Egypt, you had to do things the Egyptian way.
Yet Ptolemy V's philanthropy came at a price. Keeping the peace in Egypt proved cripplingly expensive. So the second half of the Ptolemaic dynasty was riven by debt, corruption, and vicious civil war. Soon the expanding Roman Empire bore down on a divided Egypt. Only the famous Cleopatra stood in their way. In the mould of great Uncle Alexander, she believed herself divine and managed to hold the Romans at bay for over 20 years. But not even the great Cleopatra could prevent the inevitable.
And so it was that in August 30 BC, Cleopatra's famous suicide brought an end to ancient Egypt as we know it. This epic culture, which had lasted for 3,000 years, came to an end in a matter of days when on the 31st of August, Egypt was formally annexed by Rome.